Hello and welcome to our first session for trainers and assessors in our Monday mentoring program. My name's Kerry Buttery and I'll be your presenter for today. Firstly, I'll give you a quick overview of our webinar program, so what you can expect throughout the whole year. Then we'll have a look at the standards for RTOs 2015. That will just be the parts that are relevant for you as a trainer and assessor. If you're interested in the other components of the standards, then you'll need to go and attend a workshop or a webinar covering all aspects of the standards. So we'll just focus in what you need to know as a trainer and assessor. We'll talk about continuous improvement and what the requirements are under the new standards, training and assessment documents, so essentially your training and assessment strategy, and we'll have a look at some annual planning and what you need to do in terms of planning out your time for the rest of the year. We're going to finish then on some key vet sector updates and what's been happening over the holidays. So to start with, a program overview for our mentoring program. On our website, you would have found some information when you registered, and that website has got all of the dates for your pre-recordings and your live Q&A sessions. So basically, the program's going to consist of some pre-recorded webinars like the one that you're listening to right now. The dates for the release of each of those are published on the website, and I'll remind you at the end of this webinar when the next one will be. Then you listen to that, you then attend a live Q&A session, and your Q&A session next week will be with Carol Hunter. You ask all your questions that you write down during that pre-recorded webinar. You write them down and you ask Carol those questions in the live webinar. So that's your opportunity. Please make sure that you have your questions for the live webinar, because that hour is your opportunity to ask those rather than trying to get answers to questions at other times. So a full hour is going to be devoted to answering all of those questions for you. Even if you don't have some questions, please still log into that webinar, because you can then hear what questions other people have. It might be something that you hadn't thought of, and then that way you can apply those things to what you're doing, or it might prompt you to think of something else you need to ask. So it might actually prompt you into thinking of extra questions. If you're unable to attend the live Q&A, you can email your questions through to us so that they will be passed on to Carol for the webinar. Make sure that they come to us at least a day or two before the webinar. If they're coming in after the webinar, obviously they won't be included and they'll be waiting for the next live Q&A webinar to come up. Afterwards, you'll receive an attendance certificate with each live webinar. Then you can choose to either save all of that information electronically. So you'll receive your certificate, you'll receive the PowerPoint as an electronic resource, you'll get your handout, and you'll also receive any other documents that we think might be helpful in the topics covered in that particular webinar. In the mail, some hard copy folders, notepads, pens and USBs have been posted out. So if you haven't received that already, it shouldn't be too far away. And you can then choose to print everything out if you would like to, or you can store everything on that USB and keep it in that folder, so you've got that resource there to access as you need to. In terms of the topics that are listed on the website, so if you need to see what the topics are going to be covered each webinar, you can go onto the website and have a look. If there is anything extra that you would like addressed that we haven't included in that list, please email that through and we can see if we can fit that into the schedule to make sure the mentoring program meets your needs. Keep in mind that we're dealing with compliance and training and assessment. We don't deal with apprenticeships and traineeships arrangements because this is different from state to state. So keep those questions and inquiries on the track of training and assessment and compliance. So in summary, you'll get the pre-recording so that you can go through that beforehand, have a think about the information that's been presented, write your questions down, and then you have the opportunity to ask those questions in a full hour that's dedicated to that. If you're unable to attend that live webinar, you'll still receive the recording. So even if you can't attend, send your questions through, your questions will be answered, and then you can listen to the recording later on. So getting into things for the start of the year. The first thing that you would have all heard about is that we have a new set of standards and that we're going to need to comply with these new standards from the 1st of April for existing RTOs. If you haven't had a look at the new standards yet, I've got the link here on the slide so that you can download those standards. They are going to apply to ASQA regulated RTOs from the 1st of April for existing RTOs, but we're going to have a look at some transition arrangements in a second. If you're a new RTO, so if you're a trainer assessor that's going through the process now to apply to become an RTO, then you need to be compliant with those standards now. RTOs that are in Victoria and Western Australia, if you're regulated by VRQA or Western Australian TAC, then you're going to continue to comply with the AQTF until legislation is passed that will mean that you transition to those new standards. So Parliament in each of those states needs to pass some legislation to refer over to the new standards. As I mentioned, ASQA have some transition arrangements for the new standards. We do have a little bit more detail than what's just on the screen, but what you can see initially is that from 1st of January, new RTOs that have applied from 1st of January must comply straight up. If you're an RTO that applied maybe on the 29th or the 30th of December, then your initial application means that you would be complying with the 2012 standards, and that from the 1st of April you'll need to comply with the new standards. That's to take into consideration the RTOs that had already put all the work into developing everything and setting it up based on the 2012 standards, ready to apply, and then the new ones have come out and they need some time to move over to these new standards, the same as all the other RTOs that are already registered. So for the rest of us, it's 1st of April 2015. The only part that's already in effect for everyone is the USI. So if you're not familiar with the USI, this is the Unique Student Identifier. Your RTO manager would be overseeing this process, and it's a number that's applied for each student that they take with them like a tax file number, and all their training's recorded against that in their, I suppose you'll call it like a learning account, keeps track of all the qualifications that they've done from 1st of January 2015. So there's requirements that your RTO will need to meet for that, but generally that won't be something for trainers and assessors to deal with. Some key points from the transition arrangements on ASQA's website. So the table that I've just shown you is on ASQA's website, and then there's a whole heap of further information underneath that. One of the things that is written on there is that decisions made between 1st of January and 30th of March can be made against either set of standards, depending on the circumstances. So while ASQA has said that we will be complying from 1st of April, if something happens between now and then, which needs addressing, they can apply the new standards. Generally, you'll be against the current standards until the 1st of April, and then it's the 2015 standards. From 1st of April, everything must be against the new standards. If you're up for an audit between now and the 1st of April, so let's say that your RTO is being audited in February, your audit will actually be against the new standards. So ASQA will come in, make a determination against the new standards, but the decision of non-compliance or compliance will be against the old standards, because you're not required to comply until 1st of April. The idea of that is so that your organisation would have feedback against how you're going to meet the requirements of the new standard. So essentially, you'll be audited against the new standards. A decision is made against the old standards in terms of compliance outcome, and you'll receive that feedback so that you know what you need to work towards in terms of compliance with the new standards. Last item that was on there was complaints. So if a complaint relates to the new requirements that comes in, let's say it's a marketing issue and an organisation has marketed courses that do not meet the requirements of the new standards, consideration may need to be given to when the activity a complaint relates to occurred. So if the complaint related to March last year, this was before the new standards had even been drafted. So whether that will have any impact on what standards will apply to a complaint that is made will be up to ASQA. So let's have a look at the standards. Now, as I said, I'm not going through all of the standards with you. I'm going through the components that will apply to you as a trainer and assessor. Depending on your RTO, there might be a few extra things that you would need to be looking at in terms of your responsibilities. Or maybe I'm going to go through more than you do need to know about in your RTO, because maybe you're in quite a large RTO and you don't take on as many responsibilities that people in a small RTO might take on. So the format of the standards, there is 4 parts to the standards. We've got part 1, which is preliminary information, and this includes a glossary. We'll have a look at that in a second. Part 2 is all about training and assessment. And this has standards 1 to 3 and schedules 1 and 2. This is the part that you need to know in detail. So this is the section that we're really going to focus on. Part 3 is about obligations to learners and clients, and that's standards 4 to 6 and schedules 4 and 5. And then part 4, RTO governance and administration, standards 7 and 8 and schedules 3 and 6. So when you actually open the document with the standards, it's got part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and then all the schedules are at the back behind each of the standards. And as you can see there, we have got 8 standards. So an explanation of these standards is included in the part 1 preliminary information. It talks about there being 8 standards, as I've just mentioned. These are broken down into clauses. So standard 1, the one that you really need to know in detail, has 27 clauses. Not all of those clauses are going to apply to you. So when we go through them, you'll see what they're all about. There's a context statement for each standard which explains basically the context of how that standard applies. That part is not auditable. So it gives you the information that you need, but it's not a standard that you must comply with. Now it tells us in this part 1 that the commencement of the standards will be 1st of January for new RTOs, 1st of April for continuing RTOs, and the transition arrangements, which I've gone through, that are on ASQA's website. The most important part for you to have a look at is the glossary. So the glossary will go through the key terms that some of these have actually changed. There's information about third-party arrangements. So that's something for you to have a look at, because we're not calling partnership arrangements anymore. We're calling them third-party arrangements. And third-party arrangements are not just about training and assessment, but they're also taking into consideration arrangements such as marketing of courses. So you might have a broker going out and finding your students for you, or maybe it's educational support services such as LLN support or other support that you're providing to your students through an outside organisation. So third-party arrangements are more than what we've traditionally known as partnering or partnership arrangements. It's a whole range of different things, and it's something that you'll need to have a look at in the standards to get your head around about what your responsibilities are if your organisation has any of those. This is an area that your RTO manager would be looking after, and then they would be letting you know what your responsibilities under the standards are. With the glossary, as I mentioned, make sure you go through and have a look at some of the definitions, particularly validation, industry engagement, statistically valid sample that comes under validation. There's an expanded definition for recognition of prior learning. Professional development is a definition in there which goes through all the things that you can do to meet one of the particular standards. There is also information in there about what your current industry skills may look like. So it's very important for you to go through and read that glossary. It's only a few pages long. So having a look at the key components for trainers and assessors. We're starting with Standard 1. Standard 1 has 27 clauses. So that's quite a bit. As I mentioned before, not all of that will apply to you. One of the key points in Standard 1 is that the points cover the whole scope of registration of the RTO. So in terms of compliance, the standards say that the RTO, for all of its scope of registration and consistent with its training and assessment strategies, have sufficient trainers and assessors to deliver the training and assessment. They have educational and support services needed to meet the needs of the learners. They've got learning resources to enable learners to meet the requirements for each unit of competency and are accessible to learners regardless of location or mode of delivery, and facilities, physical or virtual, and equipment to accommodate and support the needs of learners undertaking the training and assessment. And that's for all of its scope of registration. So you need to make sure that if you're delivering a course, and maybe you're the only person who's delivering that course, that you meet the vocational competence and currency for every unit of competency to make sure that your RTO has got appropriate trainers and assessors to deliver that course. The third point on the screen, training and assessment strategies and practices, include the amount of training. So this is something we're going to talk about a little bit more further on in the webinar. We're going to specifically have a look at training and assessment strategies, but you need to have a training and assessment strategy for every qualification that you're delivering, or every skill set that you're delivering, or every standalone unit of competency that you're delivering. Basically, if it's a program that you're giving to students, you need to have a training and assessment strategy for that. In talking about that, it needs to be for each cohort of students so that you're showing that you're meeting the needs of that group of learners. So it's not a generic document that you create and save and then apply over and over and over again, and you don't look at it for a couple of years. It's something that is going to be updated each time you have a new group of learners. So it might be changing the timing, it might be changing who the target group are, it might be changing what the needs of those students are, maybe adjusting assessment, but you need to make sure that that is applied separately for each cohort of learners. These standards also talk about industry relevance and engagement, and that's something that we're going to have a topic on as well. Learner support. Now, in assessment, it includes updates to the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and I'm going to go through each of these in a bit more detail soon. Systematic validation, and you're going to have a few more processes that you need to put in place for your validation. Trainers and assessors, and what you have to be qualified as a trainer and assessor. Working under supervision, and there's a few changes there. Something that's new is for TAE delivery. So if any of you are delivering the TAE, there are new requirements for what you're going to have as your qualification over the next few years. And there is also a requirement for independent validation. And lastly, we've got information on the transition of training products, which has changed from what we've been used to with the 12 months and then the 6 months for Teach Out for disadvantaged learners. One thing that we need to mention as well, in terms of learner support, the RTO determines the support needs of individual learners and provides access to educational and support services necessary for the individual learner to meet the requirements of the training product. So that means that your RTO needs to make sure that you're doing something to determine the needs of each of your learners when you're enrolling them, and that you're going through and applying any recommendations that have been made. This could also be through an external organisation, through a third-party arrangement. But that has been included in Standard 1. So going through each of those areas in a little bit more detail for you. Training and assessment strategies and practices. Now I'm going to go through this in more detail later in this webinar, so just a quick run through here. The key points about your training and assessment strategies and practices, it's covering standards 1.1 through to 1.4. Something new is the amount of training, and we will talk about that shortly. It must be consistent with the training package and VET accredited course. That's something that you've had before. So under the current standards, the 2012 standards, your task needs to be consistent with the training package. It needs to have all the units of competency that the qualification packaging rules says that it needs to have. So that hasn't changed. It needs to enable learners to meet the requirements of each unit of competency. So making sure that you've got a range of strategies in place to meet the needs of different learners. And that's where it comes into having to be customised for each group of learners that you've got. It needs to cover, or for your whole scope, you need to have your trainers and assessors, educational and support services, learning resources for each unit of competency, as I said before, facilities and equipment to accommodate and support the number of learners. So you need to have a training and assessment strategy for every qualification or training product that you've got on your scope. And that's what's meant by having whole scope. So if you've got a qualification sitting on your scope of registration that is not being delivered, it needs to have a training and assessment strategy in place, and you need to have arrangements to be able to pick that up and deliver it straight away. Everything needs to be in place. Industry relevance. This has changed a little bit since our 2012 standards. We're going to go into detail for this for session 2. So I'm only giving you a brief overview now because next time we'll go into detail about how to develop your plan. This is standards 1.5 and 1.6, and you must engage industry. You must have conversations, develop relationships, have evidence of all of those conversations with industry regarding your training and assessment strategies and practices. So not just your TAS, but what you do to put that into practice, which will be your learning resources and assessment tools, those sorts of things. So it's how you put that training and assessment strategy into practice. Current industry skills of trainers and assessors. Now, if you've been to some of our workshops before, we have recommended that you discuss with industry what your trainers and assessors need to do in terms of keeping up to date. So it's a conversation that you need to have with industry. These are my qualifications. This is the work that I've done in industry. This is what I know about this topic. This is what I feel is the current industry trend. Get some feedback from them so that you know, okay, well, these particular areas have changed again. I need to go and do some more industry currency, or I need to go and do some more PD in this area. So you need to capture feedback about your qualifications and your skills as a trainer and assessor from your industry representatives. This hasn't changed. You need to document and retain evidence to show consultation. So make sure if you have conversations with an industry person that you are either using a proforma or that you have notes taken and they've signed off on those, or it might be having a conversation with them and then afterwards sending them an email saying these are the key points we talked about, ... Can you please reply and confirm that you agree with these discussion points? When they reply, that's your evidence that they've agreed that these were the discussion points. Turn that into a PDF and save it as your industry evidence. Assessment. Again, more detail in session 2. We're going to do a big refresher on assessment. So we won't be going into detail about how to develop assessment tools because we do only have the hour, but it'll be a refresher. And we'll also be looking at the new definitions for the principles of assessment and rules of evidence because those have changed. So in the meantime, between now and our next webinar, if you'd like to, please go and have a look at tables 1.81 and 1.82 and go through those new definitions for the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. The definition of an assessment system in the glossary of the new standard states that it's a coordinated set of documented policies and procedures, including assessment materials and tools, that ensure assessments are consistent and based on the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. So it's about your whole assessment system, your whole process, who does what, how are assessments applied, what's your validation procedure that you follow, how do you moderate, all of those things that brought together, that's your assessment system along with your assessment tools. So we will have a refresher on everything that's needed in assessment. The standards do say that your assessment must comply with the requirements of the training package or VET accredited course, of course, And RPL must be offered to individual learners. So the previous standards, the 2012 standards, did mention RPL, but it wasn't explicit about whether it was a must. These standards actually state RPL must be offered to individual students. Systematic validation is something that we're going to go through in the next webinar. It's actually going to be quite a jam-packed webinar. We may need a little bit more time than 1 hour. And standards 1.9 through to 1.11 go through our systematic validation. And this is one part of the standards that has changed quite a bit. And the idea of that is that we need to improve the standard of assessment overall. Therefore, our validation processes of making sure that our assessment is up to scratch needs to change. So I've got two definitions on the screen. First one is what is validation, and the second one is statistically valid sample. So the validation process is going to be checking our assessment tools and making sure that what we've produced is valid, reliable, sufficient, current, and authentic. And we're going to review a statistically valid sample of the assessments and make recommendations for future improvements to the assessment tool, process, or outcomes, and acting upon such recommendations. So that's the definition from the standards, and then we've got some information about statistically valid. We're going to go into that in detail in the next session. So when it comes to question time, don't worry about asking too many questions with this one. You'll get all your answers in our next session. This new process for validation is going to be based on a 5-year cycle, and that is for your whole RTO. So your RTO manager will develop a plan that you will need to follow. So when your RTO manager says that your validation must be done here or here or here, then that's what you need to do. Validation is going to be at least once every 5 years, and 50% in the first 3 years. So if your RTO's got 10 training products on scope, by training products I mean different qualifications or a skill set or a standalone unit of competency, so all of those are training products. That needs to be validated. Everything for that qualification needs to be validated at least once every 5 years. So if you've got 10 qualifications on scope, 5 of those will need to be validated within the first 3 years, and the other 5 in the last 2 years. You might do that faster, as long as you've met those minimum requirements. Another important change is that appropriately qualified persons need to conduct the review, and they need to be people who are not involved in the particular instance of delivery and assessment. So if you're in a small RTO, you might only have one person that's delivering a particular qualification. It might make it a little bit difficult. You might have to go outside of your RTO to find someone who can do this validation. Please don't get confused with the independent validation that occurs for the TAE with this validation that we have here. So the definition in the standards about independent validation is it's going to be someone external. This does not have to be someone external. So this doesn't come under the definition of independent validation. This could be someone in your RTO that meets the requirements outlined in the standards for being qualified to conduct the review, but they're just not involved in the delivery and assessment for the qualification right now. So let's say, for example, I'm the RTO manager and you're the trainer and assessor. I'm qualified to deliver the course as well as you, but I'm not delivering it at the moment. You're delivering it and you've written all the assessment and the training materials. I can conduct the review. I can conduct the systematic validation because I meet the requirements to be qualified, even though we're in the same RTO. So it can still be within your organisation. It doesn't come under that independent validation definition. So just be aware of this at the moment. We'll go into this in a lot more detail in webinar 2. Something that's very important for you to know about is your qualifications you have to have as a trainer and assessor. We are going to go through this in a lot more detail in session 3, but I'm going to give you enough information now so that if you need to update qualifications, you've got it in place now and you can plan that out to be done over the course of the year. So SRTO 1.13 through to 1.24 relate to our training and assessor qualifications. Up to 1.20 is about general trainers and assessors, and then after that it's about delivering the TAE. So from 1st of April, this is when these requirements come in. From 1st of April 2015, to be a trainer and assessor, you can have your TAE, so your Cert 4 that everyone would be using now, or you can have a diploma, so you might have diploma of a vet, or higher qualification in adult education. So you might have a Masters of Adult Education. If you've got a Masters of Adult Education, you won't need to have a Cert 4. So those higher level qualifications are being recognised. Something important to note, for those of you who are currently demonstrating equivalence to the TAE, so you might hold a TAA 40104 qualification, or you might hold a BSZ, or you might have been a trainer for a very, very long time and you might have so much evidence that you can say, well, I meet the requirements of this TAE qualification. From 1st of January, you won't be able to demonstrate equivalence anymore. You're going to have to go and complete and hold your Cert 4, TAE 40110, or its successor, or you're going to need to have a diploma or higher level qualification. So from 1st of January 2016, no more demonstrating equivalence to the TAE 40110. Separate requirements for the delivery of the TAE qualifications. So if you are delivering a Cert 4 in training and assessment, there's requirements that you will need to meet as well. I'll have a look at that right now. So we've got this handout, which we will include in your resources that come out, and this gives you all the requirements at a glance. So it's a double-sided sheet if you print it out. This is based on the information in Standard 1 and Schedule 1, and the key is on this first page. So it tells us what the TAE codes are, what the assessor skill set is, and what the enterprise trainer skill sets are. So you can see there that we've got the presenting skill set, the mentoring skill set, and the enterprise trainer and assessor skill set, which was not previously included in the requirements for working under supervision. It is now. So here is a summary on the second page of those requirements. To be a trainer and assessor, you need to have vocational competence, current industry skills, be up to date with your trainer and assessor PD. All of that is the same as what you've been used to. And for this year, from the 1st of April, you can have the TAE 40110 or equivalent, or a diploma or higher level qualification in adult education. Or if you're only doing assessment, you can have the assessor skill set. From 2016, there is no equivalence allowed for those. So 2016, 2017 and beyond, you'll need to hold the qualifications. If you're a trainer working under supervision, you'll need to have vocational competence and current industry skills. You also need to hold one of the enterprise trainer skill sets that we had on the previous screen. Under the old standards, the 2012 standards, you had 2 years to demonstrate the enterprise trainer skill set. With these standards, you have to hold that skill set or demonstrate equivalence by the time you start delivering training. So it's something you need to have in place first. You don't have those 2 years anymore. Notice that in 2015 you can demonstrate equivalence to one of those, but from 2016 you need to actually hold them, the same as the TAE. When you're working under supervision, the person in charge of that person must meet the requirements of having the TAE or equivalent for 2015, and then for 2016, 2017, they need to hold the qualification. So you can see there, trainer under supervision, and it's of a qualified trainer listed above. Now, the team assessment, So if you haven't got one person who meets all the requirements, you can still work together as a team. So you have an industry expert and they will have vocational competence. And then you have your qualified assessor. So they would work together. And those requirements are the same as the other assessor. If you're delivering a TAE qualification, as you can see there, in 2015, it's okay to still have your Cert 4 TAE 40110 or equivalent or a high-level qualification in adult education. From 2016, that's still okay, but you can't demonstrate equivalence. And from 2017, you must have one of the diplomas. So holding the Cert 4 doesn't mean that you'll be able to deliver the Cert 4. You'll need to actually upgrade to one of the diploma qualifications. So in essence, 2015 equivalence is okay for your training and assessment qualification. 2016 onwards, there is no equivalence. That is different to vocational competence. So vocational competence, you can still demonstrate equivalence. So if I'm delivering a Cert 3 in business and I'm demonstrating equivalence because I've got an older version of the qualification plus all this work in industry, I can still demonstrate equivalence to the current qualification that I'm delivering. That's still okay. TAE validation, as I mentioned earlier, more detail in session 2 when we talk about validation, and this is about the independent validation of TAE materials. So we've got more detail in the standards and in Schedule 2 about those requirements. Keep in mind that an RTO can't apply for the TAE until they've been successfully registered and delivering qualifications for a minimum of 2 years, and that comes in with these new standards. And that applies to any qualification from the TAE training package. Transition arrangements are going to be changing under the new standards, as I mentioned before, and we will have a lot more detail in session 4. This is 1.26 and 1.27. So some explanation about superseded qualification. So this means your qualification has been replaced and there's a new version of the qualification. In that instance, you will have 12 months to transition to the new qualification or complete your students on the old one within that 12 months. Under the current arrangements, we have 12 months, and then we've got a further 6 months to teach out if the students are being genuinely disadvantaged. So that extra 6 months will disappear. There has been allowance for individual circumstances with different training packages where ASQA will be able to say students who are enrolled in this new qualification or this previous one and this is the new one, they can be given this extra amount of time for teach out if required. Think about the situation of the Cert 3 Children's Services moving to the Cert 3 Early Childhood Education and Care. A student who was halfway through that course, when the new one came out, they wouldn't have been able to move over to the new one, do all the extra work by the time their transition and teach out period would have been up. So there will be times when ASQA will determine that more time can be provided for the transition or teach out of a qualification, and that will be published on their website. When it comes to deleted qualifications, so this means a qualification has been deemed as being non-current, so it's not to be continued, but it doesn't have a new version, then that's when it's being deleted. In that case, because you haven't got anything to move your students to after the 12 months, you've actually got 2 years to complete your students. When it comes to skill sets, individual units of competency that you deliver, accredited short courses that are no longer current, you've got 12 months to complete. Any units that are listed in the packaging rules of other training packages, and this is the case now, they can continue to be delivered while they're listed in those packaging rules. So there are some units of competency. Let's say I'll go to the BSB OHS 201A unit. That's a Cert 2 occupational health and safety unit, which has since been superseded with a new unit. However, there are a number of qualifications in lots of different training areas that still list that unit of competency in their packaging rules. RTOs must deliver what is listed in the packaging rules. So just because there's a newer unit out, you don't go and do the new unit. You do the unit that's listed in those packaging rules, and you've got to wait until they get re-endorsed and re-released so that you can then move on to the new unit of competency. If any of you remember what happened with the LLN unit from the TAE a short while ago, the packaging rules had to be updated for the new LLN unit to be included in the packaging rules. So we were doing the old unit, TAE LLN 401A, and lots of us went and got that particular unit of competency, and that was listed in the packaging rules. Then the new unit was released, but it wasn't in those packaging rules. And so organisations that were delivering that course couldn't go and do that as a standalone unit, just to go and upgrade people to the new one. When that got put into the packaging rules now state that organisations can do the old unit or the new unit, one or the other. So we can now do that unit in that qualification listed in the packaging rules. You have to stick to what's listed. So key components then of Standard 2. Now Standard 2 has got two parts. We're talking about the quality assurance part. There is another part to it, 2.3 and 2.4, and that is about third-party arrangements. I'm not going to go into third-party arrangements at this stage. I'm just going to look at quality assurance. This is about conducting a review of your training and assessment strategies and practices. So looking at your TAS and then how you implement that, which means you're going to look at your assessment tools. You're going to look at your qualifications and your currency as a trainer, because that comes into what's in your training and assessment strategy. Anything that's in your training and assessment strategy gets reviewed, not just that one document, but everything that it links to. You would also need to be reviewing data from your quality indicators, your validation outcomes, client feedback, trainer and assessor feedback, complaints and appeals, and I would also be including in there industry engagement. So what feedback has your industry organisation given you? We will look at that at another time as well. Standard 6 is about complaints and appeals. Now this is something that your RTO manager will deal with, but I just wanted to point out to you that your RTO's complaints and appeals policy will need to be publicly available. You need to be familiar with that policy because students might be coming to you as their first point of call for their complaint or for their appeal. So you need to know what your role is in your organisation. These complaints and appeals policies apply to third parties as well. So a student can make a complaint to your RTO based on the performance or interactions that they've had with one of your third parties. Complaints and appeals must be resolved within 60 calendar days, or a notification needs to be provided to the student in writing about the progress and what's happening. So that means if a student appeals their result, it's something that you'll have to deal with quite quickly. If you go through all the processes, you go in to meet with the student and provide feedback or interact with them, take part in the process, the RTO manager does, and maybe someone else in the organisation does. If it gets to a point where everyone's done everything they can and it's still not resolved, then an independent third party needs to be brought in to help resolve the issue. So major areas of change in the new standards: qualifications of trainers and assessors, that equivalence is going to go. So you need to make sure that you've got a plan in place if you don't actually hold one of the required qualifications. Industry engagement has changed. Independent validation for TAE. Validation or systematic validation for you. Information to learners and protection of consumers is something that your RTO manager will take care of. Third-party arrangements is something your RTO manager will take care of, and an annual declaration compliance for your RTO manager as well. For further information on the new standards, you can access a summary mapping document from ASQA's website. You can get a copy of the user's guide, which is something I would recommend that you download. So the link is there. There will be a webinar held on getting ready for the new standards, which explains some of that information. We do have the Virtual Vet Summit coming up in February, 24th and 25th, and that will also have information on the new standards as well as the conference later in the year. But the mentoring program is going to take you through a range of topics over the year. And whenever we talk about something, so when we talk about the requirements for trainers and assessors, of course, we're going to be talking about that in the context of the standards. So over the course of the whole year, you will be getting PD on the new standards. Continuous improvement is our next section to have a look at. So make sure you've got any of your questions about what we've covered written down so that you can ask Carol in your live webinar, and then we're going to move on to the rest of our topics. Each year, you need to be seeking feedback from students regarding your course, your assessment, processes, everything to do with their training and assessment. Yes, your students will do quality indicator surveys. So we have our student engagement surveys and we have employer satisfaction surveys. Depending on your role in the RTO, you might be required by your RTO manager to actually get students to complete those student engagement surveys. So it might be something that you do in your time with them. Or if you're a larger RTO, your RTO manager may actually do that via email and contact the students directly. So as long as you know what your role is in the RTO to apply those surveys and then provide them back to your RTO manager, you need to follow their processes. With that information that you get back, the data needs to go into your internal review process. So your quality assurance process each year, you need to be reviewing, as I mentioned before, all the feedback that's provided by your learners and your employers and the other trainers and assessors. So you need to go and have a look at last year's quality indicator surveys. Ask your RTO manager for a copy of the reports. You also need to have a look at your competency completion rates. So if you're not aware, your RTO has to report how many students were enrolled in a qualification and how many completed. They also have to notify how many enrolled in a unit of competency and completed that. So there's some data that you can get about what your completion rate is. And you can have a look at areas where completion is poor so that you can say, okay, well, what do we need to do in that area so that we can improve that? What extra training can we provide for our students? And you also need to be seeking some feedback from your stakeholders outside of those quality indicator surveys. So the quality indicator surveys are generic dot points or generic questions that you cannot customize. The questions are mandated, so you can't go and change them to suit what you want to know. You need to have some separate questions that you would ask to get the information out of the students about particular resources that you had for them or a particular assessment piece and the time available or the resources available and how that went. Or maybe you've got questions for them about their work placement and how often they were visited and those sorts of things. So think about what you need to know from your learners for your particular course and develop some questions that you can apply and ask them over different stages of the course. So early on in the course, you might conduct a survey about the information that they were provided at the start. Do they feel like their assessment processes were explained to them well enough? Do they know what to expect for the rest of the course? And that can give you some information about how you improve the start of your course. At the end, you would ask the obvious questions about, did the course meet your expectations? If not, why not? That they believe that they learnt what they needed to learn to conduct the job in the workplace, all of those sorts of questions. Your RTO manager might have those surveys already set up for you. If not, it's something you need to consider for different stages of the course or maybe for different assessment pieces, especially if they're a new assessment piece and you need to get some feedback about how students felt those assessment pieces went. Then you need to analyse that feedback. So depending on your RTO manager, you might have a curriculum manager or someone that does that for you, or it might be your responsibility. Really depends on each RTO and what the processes are. Now, in terms of resources for assistance, when it comes to the quality indicator surveys, there are guides that you can use which tell you how to go about looking at that information. Also, in terms of software, I would recommend if you're doing surveys, you either use something like SurveyMonkey or another product that automates the process for you so that you don't have to sit there and tally up the responses. A lot of those software programs also allow you to create graphs, so it can become very visual for you. So look into that, look into what you can use to create a survey for your students so that you can get the right information out of them, not just the quality indicator information. The most important part of the whole process is that you're analysing it, and what you're looking for is positive trends. So look for areas where students are satisfied, and what you then go look at is, okay, well, students are happy with this particular area. What am I doing right? So how can I then take what I'm doing right here and apply that over there in the areas that all the comments are negative or the feedback's not so great? You're going to look for improvements from previous years or other groups. So if yours are shorter courses, then if you've made changes, have a look at what those improvements have been from that group to the next group. And of course, you're going to look for negative trends so that you know what areas you need to improve on. Then with that, you need to document what it is that you're going to do. So these are some starting questions for you. Of course, there's more that you can write about, but these would be the starting point and the minimum of what you need to cover. So once you've done your survey, you've got your graphs, you've looked at your trends, write a paragraph or two about why is the feedback negative? What can we do about it? What can you as a trainer and assessor do? Is it something that's within your scope or is it within the RTO scope? So maybe it's physical resources and you can't change the equipment that's in the organisation, but maybe you can put in an application to your manager for extra resources to be purchased. What documents do you need to change? What processes do you need to change? Who's going to be responsible? And when will it all be done? So what's your timelines? Then you can come back later on and note what has happened, what has improved, was it done on time, what's the outcome for all this? And that's your evidence of continuous improvement taking place. Each year, you need to conduct a review. So this comes under Standards 2.1, 2.2. You need to have a look at a minimum at the TAS, your assessment tools, and your student evidence. So you need to look at those processes and say, are we meeting all of the requirements we need to? What can we improve and what can we change? It's different to validation. It's just a review process for continuous improvement. The new standards require more information to be included, as I mentioned earlier, with all those dot points about taking into account quality indicator data and feedback from clients, feedback from trainers and assessors, etc. When you've done your review, this must be acted on for all assessment tools, not just those that you've reviewed. So maybe you've conducted this internal quality assurance process and you've looked at maybe 5 of your 10 assessment tools, and you make those improvements to your 5 assessment tools, but the other 5 that you haven't looked at, you had followed the same processes for those. So therefore you need to go and fix those ones up as well. So apply those improvement processes across the board. So begin 2015 by reviewing the 2014 recommendations, if a review was conducted last year, and then how these can be improved. If there was no review conducted in 2014, then it's something that you should probably plan for in the first half of this year. In terms of your training and assessment documentation, I'm talking about mainly your TAS, training and assessment strategy. According to the new standards, I've gone through the user's guide and the minimum requirements, so you might have more than this, but the minimum requirements for your TAS are on the screen. So identifying what you're offering, the mode of delivery, entry requirements, and this includes equipment that the students need to have. So if a student needs to have steel cap boots, then that needs to be in the entry requirements or what they need to have. Duration and scheduling. Now I'm going to talk about the amount of training in a minute. Assessment resources, methods and timing, learning resources, human resources and physical resources. The user's guide has all of that information in a table, and I would recommend that you access the user's guide and you go through each of those to make sure your training and assessment strategy has everything that it requires. Now, I mentioned the amount of training. The amount of training on your tasks is not necessarily the same as the volume of learning, but it is applying the volume of learning. So the AQF provides a guide to the volume of learning, and that describes how a learner who does not hold any of the competencies identified in the units of competency would take to develop from scratch all of the required skills and knowledge. And the volume of learning includes all teaching and learning activities, guided learning, classes, tutorials, study, research, learning activities, workplace, etc. The amount of training provided by your RTO is part of the overall volume of learning. So this is the amount of training inside that full volume of learning that the student will undertake. And it relates to the formal activities, including classes and other activities that you're overseeing, such as workplace learning. So it's not exactly the same thing. The amount of training is how you're applying the volume of learning. It's your role in that. If you want more information about the volume of learning, I've got the link there to the Australian Qualifications Framework explanation document. When we look at the volume of learning, it talks about years. So 1 year equals 1,200 hours. And you can see on the screen the number of years and the number of hours for each of the qualifications. Now this isn't face-to-face time. So if you're delivering a Cert 4, the maximum there is 2 years, 2,400 hours. Now you wouldn't expect that you would have 2,400 hours of face-to-face time. What you're going to put on your training and assessment strategies is how much you're going to do in terms of your formal training, or maybe the extra expectations that students are going to have in terms of work placement as well. Notice that our Cert 1 is 6 months to a year, Cert 2 the same, Cert 3 1 to 2 years, and then Cert 4 drops back down to 6 months to 2 years, and Diploma is back down to 1 to 2 years, which is the same as a Cert 3. The reason for that is that these higher level qualifications are usually building on a skill set that someone already has. And people who undertake those higher qualifications already have a lot of the skills that are taught in the Cert 1, 2 or 3 qualifications. So that's why the years aren't going up exponentially each time. So our amount of training is that we're going to apply the volume of learning to our course design. We need to then identify and explain significant variations in our tasks. So let's say that we're delivering a Cert 3 and that the Cert 3 is typically 1 to 2 years. Maybe we're going to be doing that in 1 year, but we would need to explain why we're doing it in 1 year. Maybe one of our entry requirements is that a student has already done some study beforehand, so they may already have another qualification. It might be that we're taking on people who are already in the workplace and are going to have some of the knowledge and skills that are required already. Maybe we're delivering a Cert 4 qualification and our learners already have a higher qualification that they're going to be receiving some RPL for. So as long as you can explain why you've got a significant variation from the volume of learning and that you've justified it, then that's okay. So the rationale is based on previous skills and knowledge. You explain how the learner cohort has the characteristics to achieve the required rigor and depth of training, and how they can meet all of the competency requirements in a shorter time frame. You also need to engage industry once you've developed your training and assessment strategy. So you need to seek feedback from industry on the contents of your tasks and the plans that you have. So you might develop that, take it to industry, get some feedback. They might provide some feedback about what you need to change before you implement that. And then it's going to be an ongoing part of your industry engagement plan. When you engage industry, you're not necessarily going through every dot point on your tasks. You might not even show them everything in your task, but it might be more around a discussion of, well, these are the types of units of competency we've chosen as electives. Is that going to be useful for students when they go to get a job? Or maybe our physical resources are this, and this. Is that going to be sufficient to be able to perform these tasks? So it doesn't necessarily need to be going through every dot point in your task. It definitely shouldn't be a tick and flick process. It needs to be a conversation between you and an industry person about how you're going to implement your course. And make sure that you keep documented evidence of that. Some priorities for planning for the upcoming year. To start with, you need to update your training and assessment documents in alignment with the new standards. So we've just had a look at your training and assessment strategy and what the user's guide says that you need to have in there. So one of your priorities is going to be going over and having a look at your tasks, including anything that's identified in that user's guide as needing to be in there. Also in there, you might have assessment tools that you need to go and update based on the new standards in terms of complying with the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And maybe your course needs to be looked at in terms of that amount of training. You're also going to need to develop a validation schedule. So we will go through this in a little bit more detail soon. Also in terms of your industry engagement plan and a quality assurance schedule and PD planning. When it comes to the standards update, try and attend different events that might be on, such as webinars, workshops, Vet Summit. Keep an eye out for different things that are on so that you can get more information. ASQA did conduct information sessions, and there's information on their website about those, and the PowerPoints are there for you to access. So go through the clauses in Standard 1 in the document and review your current training and assessment documents. Make sure that all of that is done by 1st of April. So it's going to be your priority. With the validation schedule, we will go into the detail with this in session 2, but be aware that you're going to need to set aside some time for the validation activities. So talk to your RTO manager about how you're going to fit that into your schedule. Between now and our next session, have a look at the standards and the user's guide for 1.9 to 1.11 so that you get an idea of what validation is going to mean. Again, next session, we're going to go through industry engagement. Just know that you need to allow some time again for industry engagement. It's not just about your assessment system, but also about your currency as a trainer and assessor. So make sure you put some time aside in your planning for the rest of the year in terms of being able to engage with industry. Have a look at the user's guide for 1.5 and 1.6. A quality assurance schedule. This is something that you'll need to work with your RTO manager on because all of the training products on your scope of registration are going to be part of this process. So you need to be able to fit in when other trainers and assessors are going to conduct their quality assurance reviews. It needs to be systematic. So your RTO manager is going to have a plan for the whole RTO. You just need to know what your role is going to be within that. With third-party arrangements, if you are involved in these, so some trainers and assessors are, because let's just say that your RTO might have an arrangement with a school and you're delivering a Cert 3 or Cert 4 or diploma within that school organisation, and it's part of your role to go out there once a fortnight or once a month and undertake certain tasks or mark the assessment or anything like that. So if you're involved in a third-party arrangement, then have a look at standards 2.3 to 2.4 because there is a requirement for systematic monitoring of that third-party arrangement. And there would be a documented written agreement that your RTO manager would have so that you can have a look at that and see what your role would be. So if you're involved in that third-party arrangement, you'll need to know when you've got to go out to those organisations or what things you need to do so that you can put that into your planning for the year. Most importantly, which we'll go through more in session 3, but you need to have a look now, is your PD planning. The reason we're looking at that in session 3 is because usually PD planning is done on a financial year basis. So have a look at the changes to the HR requirements that we've mentioned today. Look at our trainer and assessor requirements at a glance document that you'll receive. Also look at the currency of your skills. So you can see, okay, well, these are the areas where I haven't worked in industry for a while. I need to go out and do some placement on this particular topic. Look at the currency of your vet knowledge. Now, if you're doing the mentoring program and you have a few other webinars or workshops throughout the year, or you attend the conference, then you should be okay, but just plan that out so that you know what it is that you've got coming up. Also, do an analysis of your skills to determine what your needs are. So have a look at what you're delivering, have a look at what areas you're confident in, work out where you need further professional development and plan that out. Some key vet sector updates. So what's been happening? We've been working under the Department of Industry. So skills was a section that was in the Department of Industry that looked after vocational education and training. That has since been moved over to the Department of Education and Training. So over the next couple of weeks, all of the information that is in the Department of Industry's website will be moved over to the Education and Training's website. So just be aware that some of the links that you might have are going to be moving. If I skip down a few points in terms of links, the NSSC website, National Skills Standards Council, that website's been decommissioned. So all of the documents that were on there, such as your trainer and assessor requirements, quality indicators, all that information is no longer there. That's been moved to the Department of Industry's website in the skills section, and it will now be transferred over to the Department of Education and Training. So a few changes there in terms of websites. The Vet Reform Task Force has started some national consultations regarding training packages and accredited courses. So those consultations have started, and some of the recordings, I believe, are being made available on the Vet Reform website. So you can go and have a look and see what people are saying about the design of our training packages and what should change. The Australian Training Awards have opened for nominations for 2015. So have a look at the website, see if anyone in your organisation or maybe yourself should be nominated for one of those Australian Training Awards. The December 2014 ASQA update is out, so have a read of that. And finally, the final copy of the user's guide for the new standards is available, and as I've mentioned, that's definitely something that you need to have a copy of. Maybe print it out, bind it so that you've got it there so that you can refer to that quite easily. So we've gone through with the mentoring program. The standards for 2015, we've had a look at those. We've talked about continuous improvement, training and assessment strategies, annual planning, and some key vet sector updates. Now, next session, it's going to be a very full session, so it might go a little bit longer than an hour. However, because they're pre-recorded sessions, you'll be able to pause that and come back to it as you can over the course of the week. So we're looking at streamlined training packages. Now, be aware that while we haven't had any training packages endorsed for quite some time, hopefully now that everything's going ahead with standards, etc., hopefully some of our new training packages will be endorsed this year. We'll be talking about our industry engagement and validation processes, assessment requirements. So we're going to have a refresher about what needs to be there in your assessment system, and some tips for reviewing your assessment. Then every webinar we'll finish up with some key vet sector updates. So sometimes I'll have lots to talk about there, sometimes there might not be too much. That webinar will be released on the 20th of April. So thank you for your time listening to this first webinar. Make sure you've got all of your questions written down for Carol. So you'll be listening in with Carol Hunter for your live Q&A session on the 2nd of February from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Queensland time. So please be aware if you're in another state that all the times advertised are Queensland time. If you're not able to attend that live Q&A webinar but you've got some questions, make sure that they come through a couple of days before the webinar so that there's enough time for that to be passed on to Carol and included in the webinar recording. If they're not in on time, they'll roll over to be included in the next webinar. So please send them through if you do have any questions. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you next time.